The first time Walter saw them, they were small enough to fit under his arm. The second time, the river was roaring, and they were nearly as tall as he was, and yet they walked toward him. Walter remembered the sound before he remembered the sight. Back then, years ago, it had been the crack of trees snapping like matchsticks, the groan of soaked earth giving way, and above it all, the roar of the river. The spring thaw had been heavier than anyone could recall. Snowmelt poured down from the mountains, swollen with weeks of rain, turning the usually calm river into a churning wall of brown water. He'd been down by the old wooden footbridge that day, checking on the sandbags the volunteer crew had placed to protect the lower trail. That's when he'd seen them, two small shapes on the far bank, huddled together on a patch of muddy earth no bigger than a kitchen table. At first, he thought they were dogs. Then one of them moved, and the light caught their rounded ears and short muzzles. Bear cubs. The river was already licking at the edges of their little island, chewing away chunks of dirt. They had nowhere to go. Behind them was a steep wall of slick clay, impossible for something that small to climb. Walter hadn't thought about what could happen to him. He'd just kicked off his boots, waded into the freezing water, and let the current push against his legs like a living thing trying to knock him down. Each step sent a shock of cold up through his spine, but he kept going, feeling for stable footing between the submerged rocks. The cubs watched him with wide, dark eyes. One let out a thin, panicked sound, not a roar, but the kind of cry that lodged itself in your chest. Walter gritted his teeth, pushed the last few yards, and scooped the first one into his arms. Its fur was slick and cold, its tiny claws hooking instinctively into his jacket. He carried it back to the bank, set it gently down, and turned right back into the current for the second. By then, the island had shrunk to half its size. Mud sloughed away into the water, and the cub clung to the last patch of solid ground. Walter grabbed it just as the earth beneath gave way, pulling it tight against his chest as the current tried to rip them both downstream. His legs burned from the strain, but he made it back to the shallows, stumbling onto the grass with the cub still pressed against him. He'd sat there for a moment, soaked to the bone, both cubs huddled beside him, breathing fast and shallow. Then, from the shadows of the tree line, a massive shape had emerged, their mother. She hadn't charged. She hadn't growled. She'd simply stopped a dozen feet away, watching him with eyes he could never quite forget. Then, with a slow, deliberate step, she'd come forward, sniffed each cub, and gently nudged them toward the woods. They'd disappeared into the trees without a sound. Walter figured that was the last he'd ever see of them. The years that followed blurred into quiet routines. Walter kept to himself mostly, tending to his small patch of land by the river, fishing in the calmer months, mending his own fences when they leaned. He'd tell himself he didn't think about that day much, but sometimes, when the wind shifted just right, he'd catch the faint rush of water against stone and remember the weight of a shivering cub in his arms. The town had its share of floods after that, small ones, the kind that swelled the river but didn't take down trees or wash away the banks. He'd watch the water rise and fall, each time wondering if somewhere out there, those two cubs had grown and moved on, maybe forgetting him entirely. Then came the spring when the snowmelt ran longer than anyone expected. Rain layered on top of it for days, steady and relentless, until the river began to fatten, creeping past the high water marks on the old bridge pylons. By the third day, the air itself felt heavy. The wind carried the constant hiss of water rushing faster than it should. The ground near the bank was soft enough to leave deep prints. Walter knew what this meant, he'd seen it before. Late that afternoon, he stood on the bluff above the bend, looking down at the current. The water was dark with churned-up soil, moving in powerful, looping eddies. Branches spun in the pull and snapped like kindling. The sky was the color of wet slate, the horizon blurred in a low-hanging mist. He thought of those cubs again. He didn't know why. It had been so many years that if they were alive, they'd be fully grown now, long scattered across miles of forest. Still, something gnawed at him, a restlessness in his chest he couldn't name. That night, the rain came harder. The sound against the roof was like 1,000 small hammers. Walter lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the river roar louder than he'd ever heard it. He told himself it was foolish, but he couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, some wild current of memory might still flow between them. By morning, the river had spilled over its banks. Water licked at the edges of the trail, and the low meadow near the bend was already a wide, shallow pool. Walter pulled on his rain jacket, grabbed his walking stick, and headed out into the mist. Halfway down the trail, he stopped. Somewhere, through the muffled rush of water, he thought he heard movement, heavy, deliberate steps in the wet undergrowth. At first, the mist only shifted in small, ghostly swirls. Walter stood still, listening, trying to separate the sound of the river from the rhythm of the steps he swore he'd heard. The air was so saturated that each breath felt heavy in his chest. Then the undergrowth ahead trembled, not from the wind, but from something pushing through. A low branch bent and snapped back, scattering raindrops in a spray. They emerged slowly, their shapes materializing from the gray like something out of a half-remembered dream. Two bears, side by side, their wet fur clinging in thick mats, water dripping from their broad shoulders. Walter's breath caught. They were massive now, their heads nearly level with his own standing height, their bodies solid and heavy with the kind of strength only years in the wild could give. And yet, there was something in the way they moved, steady, unhurried, without any sign of threat, that stilled his instinct to step back. They stopped a dozen paces away, their dark eyes fixed on him. The one on the left tilted its head slightly, and for a heartbeat, Walter could almost see the smaller shape it had once been, a shivering cub clinging to a shrinking patch of muddy earth. The river roared behind them, swollen higher than he'd seen in years. Bits of uprooted grass and branches drifted past in the current, spinning in tight circles before being pulled downstream. Walter tightened his grip on his walking stick, though he didn't raise it. His pulse was loud in his ears, but it wasn't fear that made it race, it was recognition. One of the bears took a step forward, its paws sinking deep into the softened ground. Water pooled instantly around the indentations. The other followed, both moving toward him with a quiet certainty that felt almost deliberate. Walter stayed where he was, his boots squelching slightly in the mud as he shifted his weight. "It can't be," he murmured to himself, though his voice was swallowed by the rain. Another step. And another. Now they were close enough that he could see the fine beads of water clinging to their eyelashes, the faint scars near the base of one's ear, marks that could have come from anything, but which looked, in some unshakable way, familiar. They stopped just short of him, standing in the rain, their breath visible in short, heavy clouds. Neither lowered its head. Neither turned away. Walter's throat felt tight. After all these years, in this same stretch of land where the river had nearly taken them once before, here they were. And they had come to him. The bears didn't lunge or circle him, they simply stood there for a few beats, rain pattering against their fur, eyes locked on his. Then, without any sign of agitation, the larger of the two turned away, glancing back at him once before starting toward the riverbank. Walter frowned. He wasn't sure if it was foolish or instinctive, but he followed. The ground was a mess, soft earth giving under his boots, slick roots snaking across the trail. The smaller bear walked a few paces behind its sibling, occasionally glancing at Walter as if to check he was still coming. They led him to a narrow cut in the bank where the river had eaten away the shoreline. The water here was faster, darker, and higher than anywhere else he'd seen that morning. The current hissed and foamed around submerged logs, pulling at the edges of the muddy embankment. The larger bear stepped right to the edge and sniffed the air, scanning the opposite bank. Walter followed its gaze and froze. Across the swollen river, caught on a half-collapsed strip of mud and grass, was movement, small, twitching, and dark against the pale water. Cubs. 2 of them. They were soaked through, their tiny bodies trembling. One tried to scramble up the crumbling bank behind it, but the slope was too slick, sending it sliding back toward the edge. The other stood motionless, head low, as if trying to make itself small against the roar of the current. Walter's mind flashed back instantly, the cold water, the weight of a cub clinging to his jacket, the way the current had tried to take him. He turned to the bears beside him. They weren't looking at the cubs anymore, they were looking at him. He could feel the meaning in it, though it was beyond words. This was why they'd come. This was why they'd found him. Rain ran into his eyes, blurring the shapes, but his decision was already made. He pulled off his jacket, tossed it onto the bank, and stepped forward until the river lapped at his boots. The larger bear grunted low in its chest, a sound that wasn't warning but something else, an acknowledgement. Walter knew the river had taken pieces of land before, had pulled down trees twice his size, had swallowed anything that didn't fight hard enough. But he'd done this once, and he'd do it again. For them. Walter stepped into the river, and it was like stepping into a living thing, cold, powerful, and determined to push him back. The current slammed against his legs, shoving at his knees with a force that made every muscle in his body tense. The rain blurred the opposite bank, but he kept his eyes locked on the small, trembling shapes clinging to the mud. Behind him, he could feel movement. The larger bear had stepped into the water up to its chest, pacing along the bank beside him. The other stayed at the shore, head low, watching every step he took. Walter leaned into the current, planting each foot hard against the slippery stones beneath. The water surged higher, soaking his shirt, dragging at his arms. His walking stick was useless now, the force of the current ripped it from his hand almost instantly, sending it spinning downstream. Halfway across, the current shifted, a sudden pull to the left where the river narrowed. Walter stumbled, his boots sliding on a smooth rock. Cold water surged over his shoulders, filling his ears with the muffled roar of the flood. A deep, guttural sound cut through the rush, the larger bear, chest deep now, grunting sharply as if to urge him forward. Walter forced himself upright, lungs burning with the effort. He pushed through the last dozen yards, his body trembling from the cold, until the water grew shallower near the opposite bank. The cubs didn't move as he approached, maybe too scared to, maybe too weak. He crouched low, speaking softly over the roar of the river, his voice barely carrying. "It's all right. I've got you." He reached the first cub, scooping it into his arms. Its fur was slick and cold, its tiny paws clinging to his sleeve. He set it higher up the bank, where the slope met the base of a leaning tree. The second cub tried to step toward him but slid again, its paws sinking into the mud. Walter lunged, grabbing it just before the edge gave way entirely, sending another clump of earth tumbling into the river. Now came the hard part, getting them back across. Walter looked over his shoulder at the rushing water, then at the bears on the far side. The smaller one was pacing now, moving in tight arcs, while the larger stayed in the shallows, its dark eyes fixed on him. He took a deep breath, pulling the first cub against his chest and stepping back into the current. The cold was like knives now, each step a battle. But with the cub held high, he pushed forward, knowing there was no one else here to do this. Walter moved slowly, every step deliberate. The cub's weight wasn't much, but in the violent push of the river, even a few extra pounds made a difference. The water surged around his waist, slapping against his ribs, trying to twist him off balance. The larger bear was there, not ahead of him, but parallel, keeping pace in the shallows. Each time the current shoved him toward the deeper channel, the bear shifted closer, almost as if blocking the pull. Walter didn't dare think of it as help, but that's exactly what it felt like. Halfway across, the current took a sudden, dangerous grab at his legs. His foot slid, his knee buckled, and for a terrifying moment, he went under. The world became the roar of water and the sharp cold pressing in from every side. He broke the surface with a gasp, clutching the cub tighter, its claws hooked into his soaked shirt. He staggered forward, coughing, and there was the bear again, chest deep, its hulking body steady against the push of the water. Walter angled toward it, using the brief slack in the current behind its massive frame to catch his breath. For a moment, man and bear stood side by side in the rush, the cub pressed against him, both looking toward the far bank where the smaller bear waited. With a final push, Walter waded into shallower water, his boots finding firm ground at last. He carried the cub up the bank, setting it gently beside its sibling beneath the dripping canopy of a pine. The cubs immediately huddled together, their heads low, tiny bodies trembling, not from fear, but from the shock of cold. Walter didn't get long to catch his breath. The second cub still needed to come across. He turned, meeting the gaze of the larger bear. Rainwater ran in rivulets down its muzzle. Without sound or gesture, it moved back toward the current, the path between them clear. Walter nodded once, not sure if the bear understood, but knowing it didn't matter. He plunged back into the water. The cub on the far bank whimpered softly when he reached it, as if it remembered him from moments earlier. He lifted it into his arms, its paws curling instinctively around his arm. The trip back felt longer, the cold deeper, but again, the bear was there, pacing alongside him, never closer than a few feet, yet always where the current was strongest. When Walter finally stepped out of the river with the second cub, the smaller bear moved in immediately, nosing at them both before pressing its head briefly against Walter's shoulder. For a man who didn't believe in signs, Walter couldn't shake the feeling that this was one. Walter carried the second cub up the muddy slope, his boots squelching with each step. The rain was still steady, but it had shifted from a punishing downpour to a softer, more rhythmic fall, drumming gently against the pine needles overhead. The cubs were safe now, huddled together under the low branches of a cedar, their small bodies pressed so tightly against each other they looked like a single shape. Every so often, one would lift its head, blink at him with wide, dark eyes, then tuck itself back into the warmth of its sibling. Walter stepped back to give them space. The two full-grown bears stood just beyond the cedar, one on either side, their massive forms still and watchful. They weren't pacing now, and they weren't restless. If anything, they seemed calm. He wiped the rain from his face with the back of his hand, though it was a losing battle. His clothes were soaked through, the cold still biting into his bones. But he didn't move to leave. Something in him wanted to see this through, to make sure the cubs were truly out of danger. Minutes passed. The larger bear moved first, lowering its head toward one of the cubs. The little one answered with a soft, almost chirping sound and pressed its tiny head into the thick fur of the adult's leg. Walter watched as the other adult did the same, both bending low so the cubs could nestle against them. It was a scene so quietly tender it almost felt wrong to witness. He realized then that these two, the massive, sure-footed bears that had led him here, were likely the same cubs he'd saved all those years ago. It wasn't proof in the way a photograph or a scar could give proof, but in the way they'd moved toward him without hesitation, in the way they'd found him at all. Walter knew. The river roared in the background, but it was already pulling back from the highest points on the bank. The worst of the flood had passed. The danger, at least for today, was over. The smaller of the adult bears glanced up at him, holding his gaze for a long, unblinking moment. Then, in a movement so slow it seemed deliberate, it stepped aside, making room between itself and the cubs, as if inviting him closer. Walter didn't move just yet, but the meaning of the gesture settled deep in his chest. This wasn't just a reunion. It was trust, offered in the middle of a wild riverbank in the rain. Walter stood there for a long moment, rainwater dripping from his hair, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. The gap between himself and the bears was small, maybe 10 feet, but it felt like the kind of space you didn't cross unless invited. The larger bear lowered its head again, nuzzling one of the cubs. The smaller adult turned fully toward Walter, its eyes steady, unblinking. It didn't growl. It didn't posture. Instead, it stepped aside just enough to widen the opening between them. Walter's heart thudded in his chest. He took a cautious step forward, his hands visible, his movements slow. The bears didn't move away. The cubs watched him too, their little ears twitching at the sound of his boots in the wet earth. Another step. And another. The smell of damp fur and earth grew stronger. The larger bear's breath steamed faintly in the cool air, and Walter could hear the soft rumble in its chest, not aggressive, but a low, almost soothing sound, like a cat's purr drawn out into something deeper. When he was close enough, one of the cubs shifted toward him. Walter crouched, careful to keep his body language low and non-threatening. The cub sniffed the air, then reached forward, pressing its tiny wet nose against the back of his hand. A memory surged up so sharply it almost hurt, that same sensation, years ago, when a trembling cub had clung to him in the freezing water. The second cub followed, stepping closer until both were pressed against his knees. Walter raised a hand slowly, running it gently along the damp fur of the nearest one. It shivered under his touch, but didn't pull away. The larger bear watched, unmoving. Walter could feel the weight of its gaze, but there was no tension in it, only quiet assessment. For the next few minutes, time seemed to slow. The rain softened to a mist. The river kept up its constant rush in the background, but here, in the small shelter beneath the cedar, everything felt still. Walter wasn't sure if this was a goodbye or the beginning of something else entirely. All he knew was that, for this moment, the line between man and wild had blurred in a way he might never experience again. The rain had eased to a thin silver mist, clinging to the air like breath on a cold morning. Water dripped in steady ticks from the cedar branches, pattering onto the ground in small, perfect circles. Walter stayed crouched, the cubs still leaning into him. He could feel their tiny heartbeats through the wet fur, quick and steady. For a long time, none of the bears moved, as if they were all caught in some unspoken agreement to simply exist together in that moment. Then the larger bear shifted, stepping back toward the tree line. It paused, glancing over its shoulder at the others, and rumbled softly, a low sound that made the cubs lift their heads. The smaller adult gave a brief nudge to each cub before straightening to its full height. Walter stood slowly, not wanting to rush this part. The cubs lingered at his boots, their tiny claws catching slightly on the fabric of his pants before they finally stepped away. One of them looked back at him just once, and in that single look, he saw the echo of the cubs from all those years ago, shivering and alone on a shrinking patch of riverbank. The adults moved first, leading the way into the trees. The cubs followed close behind, their small shapes almost disappearing against the wet undergrowth. But just before they vanished entirely into the mist, the larger bear stopped. It turned fully toward Walter, its dark eyes locking onto his from across the short stretch of open ground. For a moment, the forest noise, the rain, the river, the drip of leaves seemed to dim. The bear's head dipped, slow and deliberate, before it turned again and followed the others into the shadows of the pines. Walter didn't move until the sound of their footsteps faded into the forest. Only then did he release the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He wasn't a man given to flights of imagination. But there was no mistaking what had just happened. They hadn't just found him by chance. They had come for him because they knew. And as he stood there on the muddy bank, the swollen river beside him already starting to recede, Walter realized something else. They hadn't returned for help this time. They'd returned to show him that the rescue had mattered to them and to him. Walter stayed on the riverbank long after the bears had gone. The mist thickened for a while, then began to break apart, curling upward toward a pale strip of sky. Somewhere far downstream, the river's roar softened to a steady, calmer rush. His clothes were still soaked, clinging to him with the heavy chill of the flood, but he didn't mind it now. His boots squelched in the mud as he turned to look at the cedar tree where the cubs had huddled moments earlier. Only a few faint impressions in the wet earth remained, already softening as the rainwater pooled in them. He thought of the first time, the chaos of the flood years ago, the fear in the cubs' eyes, the exhaustion in his own bones when he'd finally pulled them from the water. Back then, he'd walked away thinking he'd never see them again. But nature, it seemed, had a way of keeping its own promises. Walter started back toward the trail, the forest closing in around him. The air smelled of pine and wet soil, the kind of scent that lingered in the memory long after it faded from the nose. Every step he took was slower than the last, as if part of him expected to hear heavy paws in the mud behind him again. When he reached the ridge above the river, he paused for one last look. The water was still high, still dangerous, but no longer angry. The same could be said for him. Back at his cabin, Walter hung his jacket by the stove and lit a small fire. The warmth spread slowly, chasing away the chill in his hands. On the shelf above the hearth sat a worn tin cup, a battered pocket knife, and an old, creased photograph of the river taken decades ago. He looked at it differently now. Because now he knew, somewhere out there in the forest, the cubs he'd once saved had grown into something powerful, something wild, and yet they still remembered. Walter poured himself a mug of coffee, the steam curling upward in the dim light. He carried it to the window and stared out at the dark tree line. The day had given him no promises about tomorrow, no guarantees that he'd ever see them again. But if the river rose once more, he knew, deep down, he'd be ready. And maybe, just maybe, so would they.